I'd been gearing up for this trip for weeks, hell, maybe even months. Ever since Plaid Bandana announced their tour dates, I had this date circled in red on my calendar, hanging just above my cluttered desk at work. The night before I was to drive from Calgary to Vancouver, I couldn't sleep a wink. My head was buzzing with the melodies of Vin Stricklett's last album, the lyrics etching into my mind like sacred words. The morning air was crisp, the kind that bites at your cheeks until they're flushed with a cold pink. I loaded up my old Japanese import, a reliable beast from the 80s with more miles on it than I cared to admit. Maps sprawled across the passenger seat. In 2003, those were your lifelines, your only guard against getting utterly lost in the Rocky Mountains. I grabbed a couple of burgers and a flask full of black coffee for the road. GPS hadn't found its way into everyone's pockets yet, so it was just me, my maps, and the open road. I felt a mix of excitement and trepidation as I set off, the city lights of Calgary shrinking in my rearview mirror. As I hit the highway, the first notes of Plaid Bandana's debut album blasted through the speakers, shaking off the last vestiges of city life. I pushed the pedal a bit harder, the engine humming a tune in sync with my rising spirits. I was young, maybe too young to heed the well-meant warnings from folks on message boards talking about the treacherous paths and the sparse gas stations. The roads unfurled before me like ribbons in the vastness of the Canadian wilderness, curving around mountains and stretching under the vast expanse of the blue sky. I relished the freedom, the sheer thrill of barreling down these roads. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, replaced by a blanket of stars, a sliver of anxiety crept in. It was just me out here, miles from anywhere or anyone. My tranquility was abruptly shattered when the dashboard flickered. Once, twice. Then the headlights stuttered and darkness enveloped me. The engine cut out, and panic gripped my throat. I coasted to the side of the road, the gravel crunching under tires that had suddenly lost their life. I cursed, loud and futile, into the mountain air that threw my own fears back at me with a mocking echo. I got out, the night cold biting through my jacket as I popped the hood. The engine was as inscrutable as a stone idol, giving away nothing of its malady. I slammed the hood in frustration, a sense of defeat washing over me. I was alone, in the dark, surrounded by an unending forest that harbored sounds too sinister for my city-tuned ears. Suddenly, a massive 18-wheeler thundered past, the gust nearly knocking me off my feet. I yelled after it, a useless venting of fear and frustration. The truck was gone as quickly as it had appeared, its taillights disappearing over the crest of a hill. I slumped against my car, my heart racing. Then, as if by some miracle, the dashboard flickered back to life. The engine sputtered, then roared defiantly, as if refusing to let the night end our journey. A wave of relief washed over me, mixed with an adrenaline-fueled resolve. I jumped back in, the music kicked in where it had left off, and I was moving again, speeding into the night, driven by the twin fuels of urgency and fear. Please detour sign was like a slap in the face, unexpected, and stinging in its suddenness. Road closed due to construction. Please use Forest Service road detour in 100 meters for next, 1 kilometers for reroute. My hands tightened on the wheel as I squinted at the sign, the stark white letters ghostly in the moonlight. As I turned off the main road, the undercarriage of my old car scraped against the uneven surface of the dirt track. The flagging tape fluttered eerily on the branches, the only sign that I wasn't the first to pass this way. The forest closed in around me, a dark, oppressive tunnel that seemed to absorb both light and sound. My headlights barely cut through the darkness, and every small noise was magnified in the suffocating silence. I tried to keep count of the distance, my eyes flicking between the road and the odometer. But as the minutes stretched on, the certainty that I had driven more than a kilometer gnawed at me. No more flagging tape appeared, and the comforting rattle of my engine was the only proof I wasn't yet swallowed by the mountain shadow. That's when I saw him, or thought I did. A man, dressed like he'd walked out of a century-long past, holding a lantern that flickered as if caught in a breeze I couldn't feel. The sight was so fleeting, so surreal, that I slammed on the brakes, heart hammering. My car skidded on loose gravel, stopping just as quickly as the apparition vanished. Was I losing my mind? I shook my head, trying to clear it, convincing myself it was just the strain of the drive, the isolation. But as I pressed on, the road worsened, narrowing until the trees brushed against my mirrors with an ominous hiss. Fog rolled in, thick and disorienting, and when I realized the guardrail was gone, my breath caught in my throat. This wasn't right. This couldn't be right. The edge of the mountain loomed unseen but palpably near, a sheer drop just beyond the reach of my headlights. My progress slowed to a crawl. Every turn of the wheel felt like a gamble with stakes too high to comprehend. Then, the rocks came. First, a few small ones that clattered down the slope, a forewarning. I flinched, but pressed on, my resolve hardening into something frantic and sharp. Larger boulders followed, thundering across the road and disappearing into the void, their crashes echoing up like the roars of some great beast. My car lurched as it hit a rock I couldn't avoid, the jolt sending a spike of fear through me as the vehicle skewed dangerously close to the edge. "No!" I screamed, a raw, desperate sound that seemed to pull the night tighter around me. I felt the front tires lift, the stomach-dropping sensation of falling, then a brutal thud as the tires found ground again. I was panting, tears streaming, not from relief but from raw, unfiltered terror. I set the emergency brake, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I grabbed the map. It showed a main road, safe and wide. This path of dirt and fog was a mistake, a deadly error in my desperate rush. I inched forward, every meter of victory over the mountain that seemed eager to claim me. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, I emerged. The road widened, the fog cleared, and the night seemed almost gentle. But the relief was short-lived. The road I rejoined was too familiar, too similar to the one I had left. My mind raced. Had it been a loop, a trick of the terrain, or something else, something as inexplicable as the figure with the lantern? As I drove on, the previous hours felt both distant and oppressively close. A nightmare lived wide awake. I knew then that some roads once traveled leave tracks that aren't easily erased, not on the land and not in the soul. I always thought adventures were supposed to be fun, but sitting in the passenger seat next to Trevor as he drove us deeper into the wilds of Alabama, I wasn't so sure anymore. Trevor is my friend. Well, more like a brother, really. He's the kind of guy who's too proud to admit when he's wrong, especially about directions. He refused to use a map, claiming he remembered the way from last year when we went to the Great Smoky Mountains. I should have remembered that trip as a warning. It was just after sunset when we found ourselves winding down a narrow road surrounded by thick trees. The deeper we went, the more I felt like we were being swallowed by the darkness of the woods. My headphones were on, and I tried to lose myself in the music, trying to ignore the eerie feeling creeping up my spine. "Did we just drive in a circle?" I asked Trevor, my voice barely above the music blaring from the radio. Trevor just shook his head and said, "No, everything just looks the same out here. Just trees and mud." I wasn't convinced. The same crooked tree seemed to pass by our window more than once. Trevor noticed my uneasy glances and tried to lighten the mood. "Hey, don't worry. It's an adventure, remember?" But his chuckle didn't hide the slight worry in his eyes. The road was bumpy, and each jolt felt like a warning to turn back. It must have been around 11:40 p.m. when Trevor finally slowed the truck down. We hadn't seen another soul for hours, not even a gas station. The only light came from our headlights, casting long shadows between the trees. Suddenly, Trevor's hands tightened on the steering wheel. His knuckles turned white. "Trev, you good? See a ghost?" I tried to joke, but my own voice sounded tense. "The road," Trevor muttered. "There's bottles on the road." I squinted ahead, and sure enough, there was a row of empty beer bottles lined up across the one-lane road. My stomach twisted. This didn't feel right. "I've seen stuff like this before," Trevor whispered almost to himself. "You get out, they take the car, rob you." "Just turn around," I urged him, my voice shaking. "We're going the wrong way anyway. Just loop back to whatever exit we took." Nodding, Trevor started to back the truck up, but as he turned the truck around and stepped on the gas, a loud pop echoed through the night. One of our tires was blown, and before we knew it, the truck slid off the road and into a ditch. We were stuck, angled downwards with the back tires lifted up in the air. "Damn it!" Trevor shouted, banging his fist on the steering wheel. Neither of us knew what to do. Trevor pulled out a small handgun from under the driver's seat, along with a flashlight. "Watch me," he said as we both stepped outside into the chilly night. The flashlight and our headlights were the only things piercing the darkness. I could only see about 20 feet around us before everything melted into the pitch-black forest. Trevor shined the flashlight on the flat tire. It was lined with nails and screws. He cursed under his breath, kicking the deflated rubber. "There's a spare in the back. Take it out," he instructed. Even as I climbed into the back of the truck, I doubted we could get out of this ditch easily. I was about to grab the spare when a spine-chilling howl tore through the silence of the night. "What the hell was that?" Trevor asked softly, his voice trembling. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My heart was pounding in my chest, fear taking over as the dark woods seemed to close in around us. Whatever was out there, it was getting closer, and this adventure had turned into a nightmare. After hearing that terrifying howl, Trevor and I stood frozen for what felt like forever. The only thing lighting up the dark forest was Trevor's flashlight and our truck's headlights. I held my breath, listening to the eerie silence that followed. "Stay close," Trevor whispered as he held the flashlight steady. His other hand gripped the handgun tightly. We heard the sound again, a dragging noise that sent shivers down my spine. It was like something was being pulled across the gravel road towards us. We couldn't see anything yet, but the noise was getting louder, closer. "Maybe it's just an animal," I hoped out loud, but my voice betrayed my fear. Trevor didn't respond. He just squinted into the darkness, trying to spot whatever was making those sounds. The dragging stopped, replaced by a terrifying silence. Then out of nowhere, the forest erupted with the sound of fast-moving footsteps. I jumped back, bumping into the truck. My heart raced as I peeked around Trevor. The beam from his flashlight finally caught something, a figure stumbling towards us. It was a man, or at least it looked like one, but he moved in a way that didn't seem human. He dragged one leg as if it was too heavy for him, and his arms hung awkwardly at his sides. "Hey!" Trevor yelled, his voice echoing in the stillness. The figure quickened its pace, its movements becoming frantic. "I will shoot you," Trevor warned, aiming the gun at the approaching figure. But it didn't stop. It just kept coming faster. "Stop!" Trevor shouted. He began to back up slowly, and I followed, my eyes fixed on the figure. It was now close enough that I could see its face under the faint light. It was twisted and covered with what looked like scars and boils. It was horrifying. Trevor fired a warning shot into the air, but the figure didn't even flinch. It was like it didn't care, or maybe it couldn't understand. Then, in a panic, Trevor fired directly at it. The figure staggered but kept moving towards us. "Get in the truck," Trevor ordered, his voice shaking. I didn't hesitate. I ran to the passenger side and scrambled inside. Trevor was right behind me, but as he climbed in, he slipped and fell into the muddy ditch. Dropping his flashlight, he quickly picked himself up and dove into the truck, slamming the door shut behind him. "What is going on?" he gasped, trying to catch his breath. We both watched in horror as the figure slammed its head against the window. Bang, 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 bang. The window started to crack, and Trevor scooted towards me, trying to put as much distance between him and the glass as possible. The man outside never stopped. He hit the window over and over, chunks of flesh flying off with every impact. His face was starting to cave in from the force he was using. Finally, Trevor took aim at the figure's head and fired. The noise stopped. The man slumped down, no longer moving. Everything was silent again, except for our heavy breathing. Trevor and I looked at each other, too shocked to speak. I tried to say something, but words wouldn't come out. We just sat there, staring at the twisted, bloody figure outside. After a moment, Trevor whispered, "We need to change the tire and get out of here." I nodded, still too scared to speak. Whatever that was, I knew I never wanted to see anything like it ever again. But as we sat there, catching our breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that the night wasn't over yet. We still had to get out of this nightmare. We thought we were safe, at least for a little while, after Trevor managed to stop that terrifying man. But safety seemed like a joke now. We quickly changed the tire, the silence around us feeling heavier than before. Neither of us spoke much. What was there to say after something like that? We just wanted to get as far away as possible. Driving away, the trees seemed to close in on us. Every shadow made my heart jump, thinking something else might be out there watching us. But what we found next made everything else seem mild. We spotted an old camper off the side of the road. It looked abandoned, the kind of place you'd expect ghost stories to be about. Trevor and I exchanged a glance. "Maybe we can find help, or at least a place to call from," he suggested hesitantly. I wasn't sure about it, but there weren't many options. As we approached the camper, a rotten smell hit us. It was overpowering, making me want to gag. Trevor, covering his nose, pushed open the crumbling door. The inside was worse than the outside. It was covered in mushrooms that glowed faintly, giving the place an eerie, otherworldly light. "There's mushrooms everywhere," Trevor said, his voice muffled by his hand. I peeked inside and the sight was horrifying. The mushrooms weren't just growing on the walls, they were everywhere, covering everything in sight. The air felt thick and heavy, hard to breathe. In the corner of the camper, something even more ghastly caught my eye. A body, overwhelmed by the same fungus that took over the place. Suddenly, a loud thud made us jump. We hadn't escaped our pursuer like we thought. The creature, or whatever it was, had followed us. It slammed Trevor against the camper wall, its face not even resembling a human anymore. It was all rage and madness. Trevor struggled, trying to reach for his gun. He managed to fire 3 shots, and the creature fell, motionless. But the damage was done. Trevor looked at his arms, now scratched and bleeding. "I'm dead! I'm dead!" he kept saying, staring at his wounds in terror. "Whatever it has, I've got it now." I tried to calm him, but my own heart was racing. The thought of becoming like that creature was too much. Trevor looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. "What if I—" He couldn't finish. I didn't know what to say. The air in the camper, the spores we might have breathed in, it was all too risky. We had to get out. We left the camper and started running through the woods, not caring about the direction, just needing to get away. We ran until we couldn't anymore. Trevor stopped, out of breath, and leaned against a tree. I looked at him, seeing his pale face and scared eyes. That's when I noticed something odd about his skin, some bumps starting to form. "What?" Trevor noticed my stare. "What is it?" I shook my head, backing away. I couldn't tell him, couldn't make it real. Instead, I turned and ran as fast as I could towards the highway, towards any sign of other people. It's been a week now. I can't stop thinking about that night, about Trevor. I hope wherever he is, he's okay. But deep down, I know he's not. And now, waking up with hives and coughing blood, I fear I won't be okay either. What happened in those woods changed us, and I'm scared of what's to come. I gazed out at the winding logging trail, my mind flooding with memories of my youth. My dad would drag my sister and me out here, deep into the wilderness, to go boondocking, camping off the beaten path where the only sounds were the trees creaking and the wildlife roaming free. I had fond memories of hiking through these woods, exploring the streams and waterfalls, and sleeping underneath the stars. Now, I was bringing my own son out here, hoping to recreate those memories and forge new ones. As we turned onto the trail, the trees seemed to close in around us, casting long, ominous shadows. The air grew thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. My son was excited to be on his first boondocking trip, chattering enthusiastically in the passenger seat next to me. His name was Andrew, and at the time, he was 13 years old, just about to start high school after the summer. But as we wound deeper into the woods, I felt a growing sense of unease. The trail was familiar, but somehow different. That's when we came around a bend, and I saw it, a hulking cell phone tower, its metal latticework looming over the treetops like a giant skeleton. I felt a jolt of shock and almost offense. This monstrosity had been erected in my childhood playground. I glanced over at my son, who was staring up at the tower in awe. "Dad, look!" he exclaimed. I forced a smile, trying to hide my discomfort. "Yeah, buddy, that's quite a structure." We continued on, passing a few campers and RVs, but I couldn't shake the feeling of annoyance. That tower loomed over us, its presence disrupting the peaceful atmosphere of the woods. I decided to push on and find a spot far away from that tower, so that we could still experience the wilderness as it was meant to be. The trail grew rougher, the trees closer together, and the shadows darker. My son's chatter had died down, replaced by an uneasy silence. I could feel his eyes on me, sensing my tension. I tried to reassure him with a smile, but my mind was racing. What was that tower doing out here? Who had erected it and why? What kind of people would camp so close to such a monstrosity? The questions swirled around in my head like a vortex, drawing me into a series of dead-end thoughts. Then, just like that, I was over it. The reality was that my feelings were hurt. Seeing that tower felt like a slight against all the memories I had with my father and grandfather out here, as if it somehow overrode them and took them away from me. I just gripped the wheel and pushed deeper into the forest, determined to find a good place to spend the night. As we bumped along the road, the trees seemed to close in around us, the air growing thick with an unsettling energy. I knew we had to keep moving to find a spot where the wilderness was still wild, where the memories we would make would be untainted by that looming presence of the tower. We rounded a bend in the trail to find a picturesque meadow unfolding before us. It was nestled in a tranquil valley, the sun lighting up the area and illuminating the rolling hills and woodlands beyond. I glanced over at Andrew, his eyes wide with excitement, and I knew we'd found our perfect campsite. I parked the truck and helped Andrew gather firewood before setting up the tent. The silence was almost palpable, broken only by the occasional bird call or rustling leaves. As we worked, I couldn't help but feel a sense of nostalgia wash over me. This was what boondocking was all about, escaping the hustle and bustle, reconnecting with nature, and sharing it with the next generation. With camp now set up, we decided to take a short hike to get our bearings. The dry creek bed nearby offered a natural path, winding its way through the hills and woodlands. We followed it, our footsteps echoing off the trees until it intersected with a serene lake. The water sparkled in the fading light, and I felt a sudden jolt of recognition. "Andrew, I remember this lake," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I came here with your grandfather so many years ago." Andrew's eyes lit up. "Is there fish in there, Dad?" I smiled. "Lots and lots of trout, son. This lake is a hidden gem. Not many people even know it's back here." As we scanned the shores, I noticed something odd. There wasn't a single fisherman in sight. The lake was untouched, pristine. Andrew then asked if he could fish, and I agreed, but told him we'd have to do it tomorrow. He nodded, his face aglow with excitement. As we headed back to camp, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the meadow in a warm orange glow. We spent the evening swapping stories, watching the stars twinkle to life above. The fire crackled, and the smell of hot dogs and beans filled the air. Andrew chattered about his school year, his eyes sparkling with wonder. I listened, my heart full of pride and nostalgia. We settled in for the night, the darkness pressing in around us. I focused on the peacefulness of the moment. I think everyone has that feeling when they go camping, though. Feeling unprotected, unshielded out in the darkness of the wild. It lends a natural vulnerability. It's probably human to feel an instinctual fear deep inside when we look out into the night. Soon, though, we said goodnight to one another and went to bed. As I drifted off to sleep, the sound of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl led me back into a sense of security. I passed out and got some of the best sleep of my life that night. The morning crept over the hills, casting a warm glow over our campsite. I stirred the embers of last night's fire, adding fresh kindling to coax the flames back to life. Andrew emerged from the tent, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and we set about making breakfast. The sizzle of bacon and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee quickly filled the air, and my stomach growled in anticipation. After breakfast, we set up a makeshift archery range, our targets pinned to a tree about 30 yards away. Andrew and I took turns shooting, our bows creaking as we loosed arrow after arrow. The thunk of the arrows hitting the target was very satisfying, and we spent the morning lost in the rhythm of shooting and retrieving. This was a new pastime, not something I ever did with my father. It was cool to be forging new memories with my son. Next, we laced up our hiking boots and tackled the highest hill in the area. The climb itself was grueling, but the view from the top was breathtaking. We sat on a rocky outcrop, our legs dangling over the edge, and gazed out at the rolling hills and woodlands below. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the sweet scent of wildflowers. By the time we returned to camp, the sun was high overhead, and I was exhausted. Andrew, on the other hand, was still raring to go. "Hey, Dad, can we go fishing now?" he asked, his eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. I smiled, happy to oblige. "Sure thing, kiddo. Just be careful and don't go too far." I helped him gather his gear, and he set off towards the lake, his rod in one hand and tackle box slung over his shoulder. I watched him go, feeling a sense of pride and nostalgia wash over me. My little boy was growing up, becoming more and more independent by the day. It reminded me of myself, sneaking off to explore alone, feeling the weight of becoming a man. As soon as Andrew disappeared from view, I crawled into the tent, my eyes heavy with fatigue. I collapsed into my sleeping bag, feeling the softness envelop me. The sound of birdsong and rustling leaves lulled me into a deep sleep. As I drifted off, though, a feeling of unease quickly came over me. The woods seemed quieter than usual, the silence almost oppressive. I pushed the thought aside, telling myself I was just tired and needed to get over it. But deep down, I knew better. The wilderness was full of secrets. I had a feeling we were about to uncover one. Then something woke me up. I wasn't sure what at first, but it was very loud and abrupt, a shrill sound of some sort. I snapped awake, disoriented, unsure of where I was, or even what time it was. The stillness beyond the nylon of the tent told me the sun was going down. As I unzipped the door, I found that to be correct. Andrew was nowhere to be seen, and panic quickly rose inside me. I tried to calm myself down, reminding myself that he was handy and capable. He had a flashlight, a small first aid kit, even a pocket knife. He could take care of himself for a couple of hours. As I exited the tent, I started getting camp together, splitting kindling, getting the fire going, and prepping dinner. As the time wore on, the forest grew darker and darker, and I started to worry again. Worrying about my son, I looked over in the direction of the lake and heard that same shrill sound again, a deafening shriek from a little higher up the hill. It almost sounded like a woman screaming, but after another shriek, I placed it for what it actually was, a mountain lion. They have this incredibly shrill sound that they make, and for a moment, I was petrified. I knew Andrew was probably on his way back. I realized he could confuse the sound for a woman screaming, maybe go into the woods for help, which could be fatal. I grabbed my flashlight and my pistol and began the jog over to the lake, all while hearing that mountain lion shriek. Soon the water came into view just as the last of the sunlight was disappearing, and I could make out Andrew on the far side, getting ready to march into the woodland. On my side of the lake was all his fishing gear, but across the water, all I could see was his back. He was looking up into the trees on that hillside for any sign of what was making the sound. It had lured him all the way around the far side of the lake and was now coaxing him into the darkness, into whatever trap that animal had set. I screamed for him to stop, just in time too, and then instructed him to come over to me. He jumped, turned, and then slowly started making his way back over. It took him a while, a good 20 minutes or so, to hopscotch the rocks and shoreline, but he finally made it intact. Thank God. What the hell were you doing? Andrew admitted he thought those sounds were that of a distressed woman. I'm beyond relieved that I prevented such a fatal mistake. I explained to him the dangers of the predators in the wild. And we spent the night listening to coyotes and owls, sometimes that mountain lion, until we both slipped off to sleep. Andrew didn't catch any fish, but he did learn a great deal about survival. By the next morning, the area was thick with law enforcement, forest rangers, and even some game and fish wardens. There had been a mountain lion attack during the night, right inside someone's camp, where a man was attacked and his dog was killed. Andrew and I, blown away by our good fortune, decided not to risk our luck for another night. We packed up camp, our senses still on high alert, and made our way back down the mountain, grateful to have escaped the clutches of that mountain lion's deadly claws.